Tengo que conectarme, ya vemos que se han unido mucha gente, así que vamos a dar comienzo. Hola a todos y todas las asistentes. Hoy estamos ya cerrando nuestro seminario con esta, guardamos lo mejor para el final. Así que les quiero contar primero que mi nombre es Daniela Aldoney y a nombre de la Universidad, la UDD y la Universidad de Talca quiero darles la bienvenida a este encuentro internacional que se llama El rol de la regulación emocional en la salud mental, perspectivas básicas y aplicadas. Les invitamos también que puedan participar en esta actividad realizando las preguntas a lo largo de ella, pero usando la sección preguntas que está en la barra inferior del Zoom, para que así podemos dejar el chat solo en caso de problemas técnicos y otro tipo de interacciones con los panelistas que necesiten ser resueltas. También les queremos recordar que esta actividad está siendo transmitida a través del canal de streaming de la universidad, que es uddtv.udd.cl, y durante los próximos días dejaremos disponibles los videos de las actividades autorizadas por los expositores en el sitio web de cada facultad. Además, a todos los que se han inscrito a estas actividades, hoy día en la tarde les va a llegar un email con toda la información para que tengan acceso. Así que paciencia y tendrán toda la información en sus emails. El doctor Hastings nos va a hablar en inglés, así que para seleccionar la interpretación simultánea, deben seleccionar el icono de globo terráqueo que encontrarán en la barra inferior de su panel de Zoom. Al pinchar, deben seleccionar el idioma en el que quieren escuchar toda la actividad, sin importar en qué idioma hable el expositor. De todas formas, estaremos pendientes al chat por cualquier problema o ayuda que necesiten. You already know, Paul, that to select simultaneous interpretation, you must select the globe icon and click in there, and in your case, select English, so you can hear when we talk in Spanish. Como todos los días que no nos ha fallado la tecnología, esperemos que este no sea la excepción y que las conexiones nos acompañen, pero les pedimos consideración si es que tuviésemos algún problema técnico durante la charla. Sería una pena que el último día lo hubiese, pero nunca se sabe. Agradecemos a todos los profesionales y estudiantes interesados en participar en esta actividad. Y ahora tengo el honor de presentar a nuestro siguiente invitado, que se llama Paul Hastings. Él es profesor en el Departamento de Psicología de la Universidad de California, Davis. Además es miembro del Consorcio de Ciencias del Desarrollo Adolescente, del Centro de Estudios en Pobreza y del Centro de la Mente y Cerebro. Además es director del laboratorio Healthy Emotions, Relationship y Development, todo esto en la Universidad de UC Davis. Su investigación se centra en comprender las maneras en que los factores ambientales y biológicos moldean las trayectorias de desarrollo socioemocional en niños y niñas. Y algunos de sus focos de sus estudios se han desarrollado en torno a examinar diferencias individuales en la relación entre emoción, regulación, fisiología y temperamento, y cómo esto impacta en problemas emocionales y conductuales tanto en niños como en niñas. También se ha dedicado a examinar las diferencias de género en las experiencias de socialización y que contribuyen a diversas trayectorias en el desarrollo prosocial. También ha examinado las implicancias del desarrollo de regulación emocional en los primeros años de vida para la competencia social y desempeño académico posterior. También las relaciones entre familia, pares y salud mental y el bienestar de minorías, tanto sexuales como étnicas, y también estrategias parentales que promueven el desarrollo positivo de niños y niñas en diversos contextos estructurales y sociodemográficos. O sea, como vemos, es bastante amplio y profundo lo que él ha estado investigando en los últimos años, y no conforme con realizar investigaciones en Estados Unidos y en UC Davis, tiene investigaciones actualmente en varias ciudades de Estados Unidos, también en Canadá, en Jordania, en Bangladesh y en Ghana, y está trabajando colaborativamente con nosotros acá en la Universidad del Desarrollo. Así que sin más, los dejo para que puedan escuchar y disfrutar esta última presentación, y recuerden que en la tarde le llegarán a sus emails toda la información respectiva a las previas presentaciones. Dejo con ustedes al Dr. Paul Hastings. Thank you very much, Paul. The audience is yours.
Thank you, Daniela, and thank you to everyone at CARE for this wonderful invitation. I'm really looking forward to speaking with you all. I'm going to try to set up the screen share and see if we can get this going. Can everyone see my slides okay? Great. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking with you about developmental affective psychophysiology. That is how we can understand the links between the functioning of the autonomic nervous system and children's development of social and emotional well-being. We'll start by defining some of the key terms that I'll be talking about with regards to emotions and emotion regulation, and explaining how the autonomic nervous system works briefly as an overview of that. And the autonomic nervous system is comprised of two branches, the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system, and I'll be talking about what each of them does and how they work together. I'll then outline some overarching principles of trying to apply our understanding of both emotion and physiology to emotional processes and what we need to bear in mind as we think about children's emotional development and their physiology. And then most of the talk will be spent diving into the research that we've been doing to test these ideas of how developmental affective psychophysiology works. And then a few wrap-up thoughts of how we should look forward to the future. So briefly, emotions can be defined as integrative changes in the neurobiological, perceptual, cognitive, and behavioral systems in response to salient cues and events that prime yourself for responding to those stimuli in accord with your goals. What this means is emotions aren't things. You can't point to something and say, oh, look, that's an anger. That's a sadness. That's a happiness. Emotions are processes that are mobilizing the resources of our bodies to help us engage effectively with the things we're experiencing in the world that are evoking those emotions. Emotion regulation is the extent to which people are capable, whether that's through internal processes like neurobiology or external processes like relationships, whether that's automatic and you're not even aware that it's happening, or whether it's deliberate and conscious, the processes that people use to make that experience and expression of emotion more effective for attaining the goals. So a stimulus can evoke an emotion, and then emotion regulation is the modulation of that emotional experience and expression in order to enhance goal attainment. And for social species like humans, the primary eliciting stimuli for emotions and emotion regulations are the interactions we have with other people. This thinking about emotion and emotion regulation is based on a psychoevolutionary perspective on how we have come to be the species that we are. Functional theories of emotion suggest that we have developed and retained the repertoire of emotions that we can experience because of the fact that they have been useful and effective for us. Happiness communicates to people that we are approachable and ready to engage with them, that good things have happened and that they might share in that goodness with us. Sadness communicates that we need people to attend to our needs, helps us to slow down and to focus on where loss has occurred and what that means for the self, signals to others that we might need their assistance. Anger motivates overcoming obstacles, trying to get past things that are blocking one's goals. These emotions that we experience are present very early in life, in infancy, but our infancy is this protracted period of dependency on our caregivers that mammals, and in particular primates, including humans, are born with very limited capacities for self-care compared to, for example, reptiles and amphibians and fish. We require our caregivers to meet our needs. And the way in which that needs to be done is through emotional communication. Infants, of course, are pre-verbal, but they are highly attuned to the faces of their caregivers and to the emotional expressions of their caregivers. They orient towards the eyes and the mouth. Within a couple of months after birth, those are the most emotionally communicative parts of the face. Caregivers, in turn, are highly attuned to the emotional expressions of their infants and the extent to which infants are distressed or are engaged or are calm. And they attune their behaviors according to the emotional needs that their infants are communicating. This dynamic exchange between caregivers and infants is occurring during a period of extensive postnatal neurobiological development. So the brain and the autonomic nervous system and the other systems of the body are developing in the context of these close social interactions. In other words, our biology and how our biology both matures and forms and how it functions and is expressed is embedded in our close social relationships. And as we extend out, as infants mature into childhood and then beyond childhood, their social spheres expand, and the lessons that they've learned through caregiving and the way in which their bodies have been primed to respond to the emotional expressions of others then get spread out into their subsequent interactions, through which more learning and adjustment of the links between biology, behavior, and social environment continue. We're going to focus today on the role of the autonomic nervous system in these processes for a couple of reasons. One, it's the aspect of neurobiological functioning that has been studied for the longest. The technologies for measuring autonomic nervous system activity were developed first. So we know a lot about it. But a lot of the ways in which that technology was applied and understood was somewhat simplistic or reductionistic, of not really understanding the complexity and dynamics of the system and of its integration with the rest of the body and with our environments. We're going to talk a lot about that as we go through the talk today. The other reason for really focusing a lot on the autonomic nervous system is it is the primary means of communication between the brain and the rest of the body. When you perceive things in the environment, it is the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system that very, very rapidly, in the order of tens of milliseconds, takes your perceptual recognition of those stimuli and communicates that out to virtually all of the viscera of the body, everything that goes on your inside, and primes them for responding to those stimuli in whatever ways your brain is starting to understand the implications and the meaning of those things. And as your body is adjusting its levels of activity, that information is feeding back to the brain to inform the brain of how the body is prepared for engaging. And there's this dynamic and bidirectional flow of information through the parasympathetic and sympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system that coordinates the brain-body preparedness for social engagement with others. People have largely categorized the parasympathetic and the sympathetic nervous system as serving two functions. The parasympathetic nervous system has been called the rest and digest system because the vagus nerve, the 10th cranial nerve, through which the brain communicates with most of the organs of the body, primarily serves to calm or decrease bodily arousal levels and to facilitate more restorative processes like digestion and rest when its influence increases. So greater parasympathetic influence calms the body down. Conversely, the sympathetic nervous system, which innervates most of the same tissues as the parasympathetic nervous system, it is closely linked to fight or flight responses. It is an activating system. Increases in sympathetic activation lead to increases in bodily arousal. That's a little bit of an oversimplification, however, with regard to how these two systems work together. They're not purely antagonistic. They actually have much more complex and synergistic modes of functioning. Because they innervate the same tissues, like the heart, where the the vagus nerve and the sympathetic nerves reach different parts of the heart, they're working together on the functioning of any particular tissue like the heart to shape its influence. And we need to understand that process of how they work together. There are a few tissues that are only innervated by one system or the other. For example, our sweat glands in our skin are innervated exclusively by the sympathetic nervous system. So when you look at things like a lie detector test, where they're trying to look at how much people are sweating when they're telling a lie versus telling the truth, what that's assuming is that telling a lie is a little bit exciting or fear-producing or nervousness, and that's a sympathetic activation and perspiration increases. So what that's getting at is by looking at the functioning of different bodily tissues, we can start to get a sense of how much the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system is being activated or deactivated during different situations. For the parasympathetic nervous system, that's primarily involving measurements of what's called high-frequency heart rate variability. Your heart rate doesn't progress at a constant rate. If you have a heart rate of 60 beats per minute, for example, that doesn't mean that once every second there's a heartbeat. It's actually variable. There's not a constant interval between those things, between each beating of the heart. But that variability is not random. And there are ways to statistically isolate the components of that variability that are attributable to the influence of the parasympathetic nervous system. Sometimes that gets called vagal tone. A more accurate term is heart rate variability. And there are various ways to quantify that, like respiratory sinus arrhythmia. When you breathe in, your heart rate accelerates a little bit. When you breathe out, your heart rate slows down a little bit. That RSA is because of the fact that the parasympathetic nervous system innervates both the lungs and the heart. Pre-ejection period is an index of sympathetic activity on the heart, and it is how quickly between the sinoatrial node of the heart kind of firing its signal that it's time to start a new heartbeat to a valve opening to let blood flow from an atrium to a ventricle. And the more sympathetic innervation of the heart is occurring, the faster that interval, the briefer that period of time is. The heart is pumping faster. And then electrodermal activity, as I talked about, is your skin conductance. When you have sympathetic activation, you perspire more, and the eccrine glands of the palms of the hand secrete more perspiration. And you can detect that by putting an electric current across the hand and see how well does it flow, how much resistance to the flow of electricity across the surface of the hand occurs. We'll be talking about some of these measures through the studies, which is why I wanted to kind of get them out there. But yeah, we'll see how that functions. I want to expand a little bit more on what current perspectives on autonomic functioning are looking like. Porges has argued that it's important to think of the parasympathetic nervous system functioning in mammals differently than simply a rest and digest system, and instead to think of it as an integral part of the social engagement system. Because the parasympathetic nervous system can allow heart rate to calm down, to slow and decrease when parasympathetic activity increases, so increased parasympathetic activity, calming down, but also can withdraw its activity and allow the heart rate and the rest of the body to become more activated. Mammals, humans, can modulate their bodily arousal just by increasing and decreasing parasympathetic activity. And that's useful because it means that you can become more activated, more engaged, more attentive, more responsive to things without requiring the sympathetic nervous system to activate, because the sympathetic nervous system kicks on the fight or flight response. So when we're interacting with each other, we're able to modulate our levels of arousal while still having that calming influence of the parasympathetic nervous system. Then, as potential threats or challenges or more difficult situations emerge, the sympathetic nervous system can start to become more influential in mobilizing resources for even more active responding. Thinking about those two systems working together brings up perspectives of what's called autonomic space or autonomic coordination. In response to something that occurs in the world, the parasympathetic nervous system and the sympathetic nervous system might both turn on. They might increase in activity together. That's called co-activation, or as reflected on this figure of the degree of regulation that's going on. There's overall more regulation of the body from both branches of the autonomic nervous system. Or they might both decrease their influence, and that's called co-inhibition, a decrease in autonomic regulation through both branches. Conversely, something that people kind of more usually focus on is that in response to a stimulus, the parasympathetic nervous system might decrease its activity while the sympathetic nervous system increases its activity, leading to sympathetic dominance over arousal states. Or the opposite might occur, leading to parasympathetic dominance over arousal states. And so our experienced states of arousal in response to emotional stimuli can involve changes in both branches, either working together or in opposition to each other. So as we think about how we're going to apply this understanding of the body to children's emotional functioning, we need to kind of pull together these pieces that emotions and emotion regulation are dynamic processes. They're responses, which means that autonomic regulation also needs to be understood as a dynamic phenomenon, that it unfolds over time, and that there's no reason to think that it's going to be in a simple more is better or less is better, or more is worse or less is worse, that it's going to be a linear association, that there might be some very complicated links between changes in activity and changes in emotional functioning. The fact that emotions and physiology are responses to stimuli and events means we need to understand that the meaning of physiology is embedded in the context we're responding to. If you're looking at something that is frightening, and you're looking at something that is anger-provoking, you wouldn't necessarily expect the same physiological response to occur. Alternatively, if you're looking at a child's behavior and you see a child laughing and looking happy, you need to understand what was evoking that happiness and laughter in order to understand its meaning and what might be going on physiologically. A child who's smiling and laughing because a peer is telling a joke and being funny is probably experiencing different physiology than a child who is smiling and laughing because they've seen another peer fall off their bike and hurt their knee and sit on the ground crying. The same behavior through expression in different contexts and situations could well involve very different physiological states. A third principle is that relationships need to be understood as the primary context for the way in which this physiological functioning develops and is expressed. Nurture is nature. Our experiences of caregiving and relationships shapes our bodily expression. And then our bodies act through our relationships to influence our emotions, behavior, and adjustment. All of this changes over development. Infants to children, to adolescents to adults, our emotions are changing, our emotion regulation is changing, our physiology is changing, and the relations between these things might change as well. And that's a very complicated perspective of kind of the multiple dynamics over time that are occurring. But we shouldn't kind of go into research assuming that things are going to work the same way in children as they do in adults. We need to actually look at what is similar and what is different, what changes over time. And a last point is that although research usually does focus on one physiological system at a time, it's, the capacities of what we can measure. All of the systems exist within a single body. So the autonomic nervous system, its two branches are in the same body as the brain, as the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis system, as our gonadal systems, as our immunological systems. All of these things are functioning together. So even when we're looking at one system at a time in studies, we need to think about what the implications of that are for how it's coordinated with the rest of the body. So let's look at some examples of this in the research that I've been doing with my colleagues and my students here at the University of California, Davis. There's quite a bit of evidence that tonic, basal, or baseline, your usual typical levels of parasympathetic activity as reflected in indices of heart rate variability like RSA, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, that parasympathetic activity is just lower in many populations who experience symptoms or diagnoses of mental health problems. And a proposal has been made that parasympathetic activity in its baseline state or at rest might be a biomarker of people's capacities for effective emotion regulation. In effect, people argue that if you have greater basal heart rate variability, you have greater capacity for parasympathetic influence over arousal. If you have greater parasympathetic regulation of arousal, that should contribute to greater preparedness or capacity for effective emotion regulation. But the parasympathetic nervous system isn't only related to regulation. It's also related to thresholds for arousal, that you need a cue, you need to be able to respond to the cues in the environment. And that if you have really strong parasympathetic activity that is calming or soothing or down-regulating the body, maybe some of the subtle indicators of emotion that exist in the world aren't strong enough to trigger the body's response. And we might overlook or miss some things. So is more necessarily better? So if basal RSA relates to both emotion regulation and threshold for arousal, and the emotions of other people are the salient cues for one's own emotional arousal that then needs to be regulated, how would we expect baseline heart rate variability to be related to how attentive we are to the emotions of others? We recently investigated this question in adults by doing fMRI scans of adults' brains while they were looking at emotional faces. And they were asked to either just watch the screen and look at the faces that appear on the screen in one condition, or in another condition, we're asked to imitate those emotion faces. Make the same face yourself. And then we also measured their resting baseline heart rate variability. What we were thinking is that in the imitation condition, people are being primed to actively attend to the emotion, and they are engaging their responses. But in the passive observation condition, we're just looking at how naturally are they responsive and attentive and reactive to those faces. And what we were interested in is how did that relate to activity within the social brain, the mirror neuron system, parts of the brain that are known to be involved in our emotional and social engagement with others. And what we found was that on both the left and right hemispheres, there were 3 regions of the social brain that were negatively associated with respiratory sinus arrhythmia and SDNN, another quantification of heart rate variability. The inferior frontal gyrus, the insula, and the amygdala. In other words, people who had higher baseline RSA when they were simply passively observing emotional faces had less engagement of the mirror neuron system or the social brain in these regions. But that was, and that's reflected here in these negative correlations. But that was not the case when we actually prime them to pay attention. So when they know they need to pay attention to emotion, they can. They're able to engage that system. But when it's just a spontaneous individual difference that's emerging, we see that having lower baseline parasympathetic activity might make individuals more sensitive to engagement of their social brains. So higher basal RSA supports better regulation of emotion, but lower basal RSA reflects lower threshold for emotional arousal. So what's better? Should you have it higher or should you have it lower? What supports optimal social emotional well-being? Hogan and his colleagues at University of California, Berkeley published a study in 2014 in which they showed that in adults, having moderate levels of baseline RSA, sort of average but not really high or really low parasympathetic activity at rest, moderate baseline RSA was associated with more prosocial responding in adults. It was an inverted U-shaped curve. And that gets identified as a quadratic association. And so my students, Jonas Miller and Sarah Colley, looked at this in 3 samples of children. And indeed, they found that preschoolers' RSA was quadratically associated with their expressed empathic concern in response to an adult pretending to be sad and injured. Those kids with moderate baseline RSA had higher levels of empathic concern on average and reported that they engaged in more prosocial behavior compared to children with lower or higher RSA. And that was even true 5 years later after RSA had been recorded. Those preschoolers who had moderate baseline RSA still reported engaging in more prosocial behavior than kids with lower or higher RSA. Currently, I'm looking at this in adolescents here in Northern California, and we measured RSA in the adolescents when the adolescents were 17 years old, and then we assessed various aspects of their prosociality 2 years later when they were 19 years old. And we found that that quadratic association was also present, although you can see it's really kind of driven by this high baseline RSA corresponding with lower levels in an index of their prosocial behavior in the community, the extent to which they engaged in volunteer work and assisting people outside of their home and peer network. And in addition, with their cognitive empathy, we used the reading the minds and the eyes task of how well they could recognize and distinguish emotions based on looking at people's eyes only. And we found that kids with adolescents with moderate baseline RSA performed better on the task when they were in families that were highly supportive, when they described their parents and their siblings as positively engaged with them. What this suggests is their relationship context influences the expression of their physiology. This individual difference in their parasympathetic regulation gets manifested most strongly when they're in a positive family environment that helps that get communicated. They utilize those resources through their learning of positive engagement with others. So, does moderate parasympathetic activity also support other aspects of social and emotional well-being? There's some work to suggest that it does. Kogan and colleagues found that adults with moderate parasympathetic activity also reported greater life satisfaction. And Spangler and colleagues did executive function tests with adults and found that adults with moderate basal RSA performed better on tests of executive function, that is their cognitive self-regulation. Would this be true for children as well? We have a paper coming out this year in which Elisa Ugarte showed that that was the case. She analyzed data in which we had collected baseline RSA from preschool age children who were then followed over the subsequent 5 years. This is one of the same samples that was described in the study by Jonas Miller. They were followed over the same, over 5 years with 4 assessments in which mothers reported on the children's internalizing and externalizing problems and on their emotion socialization practices. And I know you've learned a little bit about emotion socialization in this conference already. So we were looking at the extent to which mothers reported that they engaged in negative responses to their children's emotions. They were punitive or dismissive of their children's expressions of emotions. And then we wanted to see, did baseline RSA at preschool age predict how problems and socialization developed and how the relations between socialization and problems developed? And what we found was that children with moderate baseline RSA at 3.5 years of age had fewer internalizing and externalizing problems across the subsequent 4 assessments than children with either lower or higher baseline RSA. And the within-person variability in their experiences of negative emotion socialization practices from their mothers were associated more strongly with their expression of internalizing and externalizing problems when they had lower or higher baseline RSA than when they had average baseline RSA. What does that mean? Within-person analysis is looking not at how different children are, what distinguishes between children, but instead what predicts how a given child is functioning over repeated assessments over time. So across the 4 assessments, we could see what was typical for a given child's expression of internalizing and externalizing problems, and what was typical or average for their experience of mother's negative responses to emotions. On those assessments, when mothers were showing greater negative responses to emotions than average for that mother and child, the child was expressing more internalizing and externalizing problems than average for that child if they did not have moderate baseline vagal tone, respiratory sinus arrhythmia, suggesting that this is a physiological buffer against the extent to which maternal negative emotion socialization and fluctuations in maternal negative emotion socialization might exacerbate children's problems over time and development. This kind of calls into question whether we should really be thinking of higher baseline respiratory sinus arrhythmia as a physiological biomarker for better emotion regulation. That's a very strong opinion in the psychophysiology literature, but very few researchers actually test for nonlinear associations. And it's possible that they're overlooking the fact that when you move towards more extreme levels of physiological activity, that linear association doesn't hold. Moderate tonic parasympathetic activity might support better emotional functioning across a variety of aspects of adjustment, and might protect or buffer children against experiencing more problems or dysregulation when their relationship contexts are more aversive. In other words, again, nature, the physiology, the internal, might get expressed through their experiences of nurture, changes in their relationship contexts. Well, this is parasympathetic activity. I talked about the fact that there are 2 branches of the autonomic nervous system. What about sympathetic nervous system activity? Is it involved in prosocial responding? When you think about it, when you have to act positively towards, or when you are trying to act positively towards others, that's a behavior that requires mobilization of resources. In an extensive review of the literature that existed up until the mid 2010s, my colleagues and I concluded that these studies on the links between autonomic activity and prosociality pointed towards a pattern of autonomic co-activation or simultaneous modest increases in both parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation of the body's tissues as being most conducive towards positive, other-oriented, affective, and behavioral responses to the needs of others. In other words, being prosocial might require the activity of both systems, not just one. We recently tested this in Dr. Cam Hossener's lab with a study that Nick Van Allen did for his dissertation. And indeed, he found that when he examined cardiac autonomic balance, that dimension of the relative influence of both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system on the heart, 9 and 10-year-old children who had moderate levels of cardiac autonomic balance were more willing or donated higher amounts of money to sick children in a hospital. This was in a study where the children were receiving dollar bills for the tasks that they were doing in the study. And after doing a series of tasks, they were then told that if they wanted to, they could donate some money to some kids in a sick children's hospital, but they didn't have to, it was up to them. And the children were then left alone to put some of their money into a box for the other kids if they wanted to. And what you can see is children who had moderate levels of resting cardiac autonomic balance, a balance of parasympathetic and sympathetic activity, donated significantly more of their money, 4 out of $10 on average, than children with either dominant sympathetic activity, higher, stronger PEP than RSA, or dominant parasympathetic activity. And by the way, that money was actually donated to children in a hospital, so the children weren't being deceived. Some people have called this the Goldilocks effect. Not too little, not too much, but just right. There might be an autonomic sweet spot of some joint parasympathetic and sympathetic activity that helps children to be prepared to engage in well-regulated, positive behaviors towards others. But when you think about it, none of that's really dynamic. We're talking about baseline physiology, kind of the individual differences that children carry with them before they've engaged with stimuli. What happens when they're actually responding to emotional stimuli? What are well-regulated autonomic responses? Sarah Cawley has done a series of studies examining this, in which she measured the sympathetic index of cardiac pre-ejection period, and she coded children's expressed emotions and emotion regulation behaviors while they went through frustrating activities. At 3.5 years of age, she used the impossible circle task, in which children are asked to draw a perfect circle, and every circle that they draw is described as, no, that's not a perfect circle, try again, for 3 minutes. And an impossible puzzle task, in which children are given a puzzle to solve, but some of the pieces aren't correct, and there's no way to solve the puzzle. That is evoking frustration, irritation, anger. And you would expect there to be sympathetic reactivity to that. But then she tried to correct the situation. She apologized, she praised the children's performance, she gave them the right pieces, she recognized one of the circles as really good, and they went through a period of recovery, of trying to bring things back to a positive state. And she was interested in looking at how physiological change during reactivity and recovery, during provocation and restoration of the relationship, was related to children's expressed emotion and emotion regulation behaviors, and also asked mothers to report on what was typical for their children's emotional functioning. Frustration is an activating emotion. You expect greater sympathetic activity. This should be reflected in decreased pre-ejection period. Shorter pre-ejection period, faster beating of the heart. What she found was For children who engaged in positive verbalizations during the reactivity period, that is, they tried to kind of reframe their experience of, oh, it might not be a perfect circle, but it's a good balloon. They were showing that pattern of shortening PEP that you would expect to go along with anger, but then they recovered more quickly than children who did not engage in these kinds of positive verbalizations. Conversely, children who primarily were regulating their behavior through attention diversion, they were looking away from the page where they were drawing circles, they were putting down their pens, they were disengaging from the task. They did not show sympathetic activation during the provocation. So attention diversion was working for keeping their bodies calm, but then after the examiner stopped provoking them and tried to re-engage them in positive activity, their PEP shortened. They actually started to move into a physiological state that looked more like what you would expect for anger after the provocation had stopped. And when we looked at mothers' reports of the children's typical levels of emotion regulation, lengthening PEP, decreasing sympathetic activity after the provocation is what was associated with being better well-regulated in general. Not how activated the body was in response to the task, but how well they recovered from it. When you think about it, one of the things that you really want as a parent when your child gets upset is for your child to be able to calm down. That calming down is occurring physiologically when the sympathetic nervous system stops saying, okay, there's something for me to be upset about. At 6 years of age, a very similar finding emerged. Those kids who showed greater sympathetic deactivation, lengthening of pre-ejection period, after the provocation had ended, were described by their mothers as having fewer externalizing problems, and in particular, fewer problems with anger regulation. So these dynamic changes in physiology are associated with children's emotion regulation behaviors and capacities and how those get expressed in their well-being. I see the time clicking by, and I'm just going to quickly say that we see similar things going on with parasympathetic activity. In response to emotional videos, we record children's physiology, and we see that there's similar patterns of parasympathetic engagement and disengagement to displays of anger, displays of fear, and displays of sadness in videos. And when we extract this index of vagal flexibility, the ability to flexibly disengage and re-engage parasympathetic activity, we find that it predicts having fewer problems, fewer externalizing problems in particular, especially when children are with mothers who do not engage in authoritarian parenting practices. Or phrased another way, for those children who don't show very good vagal flexibility, with this being the dynamic change and this being less appropriate change to the stimuli, if they experience more aggressive, strict, punitive parenting from their mothers, they manifest higher levels of externalizing problems, overdevelopment. Last thing I'll mention is where we did an experimental test to see, are we actually right in thinking that the way in which our autonomic nervous system changes in response to emotional stimuli is a reflection of how we're interpreting the meaning of that stimuli and its implications for how we should respond. We tested this assumption by doing an experiment with adults. We used transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a technique for temporarily suppressing activities of specific loci of the brain. we applied TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, to the right temporal parietal junction of the brain. Or in a randomly selected group of individuals, we did a pretend TMS that felt similar but didn't actually have that effect of suppressing the activity. And then we looked at how people responded to a sadness induction video physiologically. We focused on the right TPJ because it's associated with perspective taking and representing of self versus other. In other words, it's linked to aspects of cognitive and emotional empathy, how well people can attend to and respond to the emotions of others. And what we found was this pattern of vagal flexibility, of decreasing and re-engaging parasympathetic activity, was only evident for the group that had the sham TMS. Applying transcranial magnetic stimulation to the temporal parietal junction produced a pattern of just continual withdrawal of parasympathetic activity as the SAD video continued. This was not the case with their sympathetic activity. Sympathetic activity increased across the video. It increased a little bit, not quite significantly more for the people who did not receive TMS. But what we see here is there's this, in effect, pattern of co-activation of sympathetic and parasympathetic activity for the people who received the stimulation to the right TPJ, but just this sort of reciprocal sympathetic activation, decreasing parasympathetic, increasing sympathetic for those people who received the TMS to the TPJ. What are the implications of that? Well, it suggests that they were, by shutting down the part of the brain that focused on self-other distinction and others understanding other people's perspectives, we reduced the kinds of physiological autonomic activity that we think are reflective of effective emotion regulation. And it resulted in people who received TMS to the right TPJ reporting at the end of the video that they were more annoyed by it, and they felt a little bit less compassion for the sad characters in the video. So to wrap it up, what this work is starting to reveal is that just like the things we study, just like emotion regulation, physiology, and the relations between these things and how they change over development, our field is rapidly changing and growing. We're getting a lot more insight into the complexity and nuances of how the autonomic nervous system functions in complex, multifaceted, and socially embedded ways to support our positive engagement with others, or under less positive circumstances, serve to undermine our social and emotional well-being. By using these kinds of techniques and practices in our research and in our analyses, we're going to be able to have a better understanding of how to apply theory and research in the work that we do with families. In other studies that I didn't talk about today, we've actually shown that changing parenting changes children's physiological functioning, and we can help parents to become more positively engaged with the emotional needs of their children, and that produces changes in their physiological activity that look more like the well-regulated physiology that I've been describing today. So for us to put into practice effective efforts to help children's self-regulation and emotional well-being, we need to understand the ways in which their bodies are working and the experiences in their lives that will help their bodies to work better. And I'll wrap it up there for today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Wow, a lot of information and very interesting. We have some questions here. We have some couple of minutes, if you allow, because you have to say stop if you have to run. But here are some Here's a question actually in English, so I can read it directly and people can translate. From Victoria Bravo. She's from Kaiser, Oakland, California, is there. And she says, there has been an increase in social anxiety in kids and teens. How that can be explained from a physiological activity and current social environment?
Thank you. That's a really interesting and important question. One of the things that we really wished we had been able to do was to continue these studies during the past 14 months of the pandemic. But because of the social distancing and health requirements, we couldn't actually work directly with people to put electrodes on their bodies and measure their physiology up close to their faces. So we'd have to take some guesses on that. But the disruptions that occurred in the pandemic situation, with isolation with peers, with families being clustered together and not necessarily being able to access private spaces when they want some alone time, with unexpected events, with fear, it is probably leading to a state of persistent increased sympathetic dominance over our physiological arousal. Our fight and flight systems are probably being chronically activated. There's a lot of implications of that because it will exhaust our emotional resources and our physiological resources. It's very expensive and taxing on the body to maintain these states of arousal. And that will deplete our reserves and our capacity for calming ourselves down and for engaging in positive behaviors. That then gets expressed emotionally and behaviorally through things like symptoms of anxiety and depression and oppositional and angry behaviors. There's a lot of work showing that the effectiveness with which parents have helped to keep home life working pretty well, to keep things organized, to be sensitive to their children's needs for both routine and predictability, but also to be able to kind of disengage and stop and say, okay, let's take a break, you need your space, etc. That parents who are able to do that more effectively have children who are manifesting fewer problems. And it goes the other way too. In one of the studies that we were able to continue in Jordan, we had measured children's and mothers' physiology prior to the pandemic. And we focused on that study on cortisol. Cortisol is a hormone produced by the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis system. And we looked at cortisol in hair, which is kind of a repository of how much activity of the HPA is going on over a period of weeks and months. We looked at that in 2019 in the main study. And then in Jordan, we were able to get parents to collect their own hair samples and their child's hair samples again 3 months after the pandemic started in June 2020. So we could see how was their prior physiology predicting their future physiology, and how is physiology associated with family functioning and adjustment. There was not actually an increase in overall cortisol from before the pandemic to after the pandemic. These were predominantly low-income families. There were some Syrian refugee families in the group. They were families that were experiencing quite a bit of stress to begin with before the pandemic began. But what we found was their hair cortisol was associated with their family functioning. More families in which mothers had been more capable of keeping things organized and predictable and calm and engaged, that was associated with lower cortisol levels in the hair. And conversely, kids who had really high cortisol levels to begin with, their cortisol levels actually decreased from before the pandemic to after the pandemic if their mothers had engaged in those kinds of behaviors. So I think that there's understanding kind of the combinations of nature and nurture, of relationships and physiology, is going to take us a lot further for understanding the reasons why some individuals are manifesting increasing levels of anxiety and depression, but others aren't, and how we can use that information to start to help those who are manifesting more difficulties.
Right. Can you stop sharing so we can see your face?
Sure.
And your nice background. Here we have also another question from Carola, Carola Perez. And I'm going to ask that in Spanish, so if you could put the translation so everyone can get that. And she asks, considerando que existen niños y adolescentes más o menos reactivos del temperamento, el impacto que la manera en que padres pueden ayudar o ejercer en la recuperación permite, por un lado, aceptar la emoción que surge, pero a la vez desarrollar capacidades regulatorias propias. Bueno, esto es más un comentario que una pregunta, pero lo piensa para buscar el mejor momento para una mejor recuperación.
I agree. And we need to understand how these things are functioning together. And it's going to be affecting parents as well as children. So there are children who are, whether it's because of their genetics and temperament, or whether it's because of their early upbringing in infancy and toddlerhood, or the interaction of those things and how what they were born with and what they experienced is contributing to the maturation of their systems, they are less reactive. They are calmer. They are, or when they do experience emotional arousal, they're more able to calm down. And work seems to indicate that those children, as development continues, are more or less both less likely to manifest problems and difficulties and are less sensitive to changes in the environment. That when their parents are having a bad period of time and are more stressed and are less patient with them, they're less likely to react strongly and to manifest difficulties and problems. Kids who have more dynamically reactive emotional ranges of their physiology seem to be more sensitive to changes in their environment. From a biological sensitivity perspective or a differential susceptibility perspective, the work of Ellis and Boyce and Belsky and their colleagues, I think you had Marinus van Eijendorn earlier in the meeting perhaps, it suggests that they will be ready to respond to positive environments and do well, to engage with those positive environments and to kind of thrive, but they're also sensitive to when those things stop and when more aversive events occur, and then they're more likely to have difficulty with that. The differential susceptibility literature is really exciting, but it does need to be doing more of these kinds of repeated assessments over time to look at how environment changes and whether changes in the environment are associated with changes in more sensitive or susceptible children's functioning with those changes. So more of these kinds of within-person analyses of the kind that I was describing that Elisa Ugarte did.
Yeah, great. I think all the data is showing that we're even more complex than we thought, and that means or medians are not very helpful in many cases. Here's another question in Spanish. So, sure. And I know you have done work with this in even publications, so it's a great question too. ¿Conoce evidencia sobre la relación entre la desregulación emocional patológica dada por una actividad crónica del sistema simpático y el surgimiento de enfermedades físicas?
Okay, so links between experiences of stress and adversity, physiological functioning, and the manifestation of physical problems, not just mental health problems. Okay. Yes. In actually one of the, not a study that I did, but I mentioned Dr. Cam Hostenar and her lab through the talk, and Nick Allen's research. They did secondary analyses of a national data set here in the US in which adults for many years have been surveyed about their recollected experiences of their upbringing, their mental health, their physical health, and then they collected physiological measures, including autonomic physiological measures. And there's a field of research in health psychology showing that greater baseline heart rate variability, higher RSA, is associated with decreased risk for cardiovascular disease. And what they found in their analysis was that those adults who were called warmer, more supportive, more affectionate family environments in their childhood, they had higher respiratory sinus arrhythmia, more parasympathetic enervation. They had lower blood pressure and fewer symptoms of cardiovascular disease, and RSA mediated that link. So the link between childhood upbringing and adult physical health was explained through their autonomic functioning. And that's one recent example that I think if I'm remembering correctly, I think they published that in Psychosomatic Medicine. But there are many other studies that show these links. We've done it in analyses of the impacts of poverty on physiological functioning and shown that poverty predicts worse autonomic and adrenocortical and inflammatory regulation. And in turn, the autonomic, adrenocortical, and inflammatory regulation is associated with physical health problems. And those are in studies that follow participants from early adolescence into early adulthood. If we're able to continue working with those populations as they progress further into their 30s and 40s, when more physical health problems become likely, then we might even see some new associations emerging there.
Great, we are past time, but since I'm being the moderator, I will take the last question for me. It's like an application questions to know more about interventions, because you're showing this spectacular data on baseline physiology and how we can improve intervention or understand better the trajectory of children and family. How should we go further to have another way maybe to assess that? Because how do we know the baseline physiologic of children? Like the way that we're doing it right now is very it's very expensive, and then it's not easy for everyone, and there's data that is important. So how can we find, I don't know, proxies, or what can we do with that information?
Well, that's a really, really important line of work. And there have been really impressive advances in the measurement of these aspects of physiology with smartwatches and other wearables. They're not perfect. We've tried to use them in research, and they're not exactly as good as the more sophisticated equipment, but they keep getting better. And we're going to be able to monitor these aspects of physiological functioning non-invasively and not expensively in more contexts. I mentioned Sarah Colley a few times in the talk. She's now a postdoc at the School of Medicine, and they've been doing a study in which they're working with families with children with high levels of disruptive behavior problems and implementing family therapy, but doing it in their primary point of care, in their doctor's offices or their community clinics. And what they've done is measured the children's physiology when they first come in, when they're referred for treatment. And then the mothers are receiving kind of parent training intervention to be able to work effectively with those children, and then measuring the children's physiology again afterwards. And they're doing that all within the doctor's offices, their primary point of care, where physiology is being measured anyway. And it was a small pilot study to kind of document the feasibility, but even in that small sample, she's finding that in a randomized controlled trial assignment, they're seeing some adaptive changes in the children's physiology for the children of mothers who received that intervention compared to mothers who didn't. So as we get more able to incorporate physiological measurement into the kinds of health procedures that we do with children and families anyway already, I think we'll be able to use this information even more effectively to do some individual tailoring of what families need in order to support their well-being.
Yeah, and waiting for technology. So we're expecting that.
This is one of the reasons we have multiple colleagues in multiple fields who know how to do things we don't.
That's so hard. Yeah. I'm going to switch to Spanish to say goodbye. So les doy las gracias a todos, especialmente a Dr. Paul Hastings. Sabemos que quedaron preguntas en el tintero, pero por tiempo vamos a tener que dejar hasta acá nuestra conversación de hoy. Recuerden que durante la tarde recibirán un correo electrónico indicándoles cómo pueden acceder a todas las charlas que pudieron ser grabadas y que van a ser socializadas con ustedes. Agradecemos nuevamente a todos los que se unieron, a Paul Hastings por estar allá tan lejos con nosotros. La próxima vez esperemos que sea en persona y les deseo un muy buen fin de semana, sigan cuidándose y muchas gracias por haber participado. Queden atentos a nuevos eventos que tendremos para ustedes. Bye.